Today's date is April 7, 2017. At 10:20 a.m. this morning, Qantas flight QF29, operated by a Boeing 747-400, will depart Melbourne's Tullamarine International Airport on a scheduled service bound for the Asian metropolis of Hong Kong. On board will be 347 passengers and 17 crew, including an augmented cockpit complement of captain, first officer and second officer. Flight time for the journey north runs consistently in around 9 hours and 40 minutes. The climb and cruise phase of the flight will pass without incident. However, during descent, ATC will instruct QF29 to enter a published holding pattern in order to alleviate inbound congestion to Hong Kong International. What happens next occurs rapidly and completely without warning. While entering the holding pattern, the aircraft's aerodynamic stall warning stick shaker will activate a number of times, and the aircraft will experience multiple pitch oscillations with associated vertical acceleration. During these upsets, unrestrained passengers and cabin crew members will strike the cabin ceiling and furnishings. Coincidentally, a lavatory smoke alarm will be triggered, attracting the crew's attention to the possibility of fire in the cabin. Sometime later, the aircraft will land safely at Hong Kong International Airport without further incident, with 4 cabin crew members and 2 passengers suffering minor injuries, with additional minor damage being reported to the cabin infrastructure. In order to explain what actually happened to QF29, it will be necessary to return to the basic principles of aerodynamic flight. Those same rules which govern how aircraft stay safely airborne, from the smallest Cessna to the queen of the skies herself, the Boeing 747. During the incident event, all 3 cockpit crew will be present on the flight deck. The captain on the day will have a total of just over 25,500 hours, just under half of which will have been gained on the Boeing 747. His first officer, with a total of nearly 16,500 hours, will have already accumulated a total of 5,000 hours on the aircraft type. To the rear of the 2 operating pilots, and occupying one of the cockpit jump seats, will be the second officer, the 3rd member of this augmented crew. The least experienced of the 3, he will have a total of just over 8,500 hours, again 5,000 of which will have been gained on the 747. Entering the airspace surrounding Hong Kong at approximately 17:45 local time, QF29 will be maintaining flight level 300 as it approaches the waypoint Betty. Still operating in daylight, meteorological conditions will be fair with no turbulence and good visibility. The captain as PF will be flying the aircraft, with autopilot engaged in lateral navigation, or LNAV, and vertical navigation, VNAV modes, meaning that lateral and vertical guidance and manipulation of the aircraft has been accomplished through the onboard flight management computer. In addition, and working in conjunction with the FMC, the auto throttle will be regulating the required engine power. Interaction with ATC will suggest that due to congestion ahead, inbound holding delays are a distinct possibility. With this in mind, the crew will make reference to the aircraft's flight management computer. Its navigation prediction for the descent is that if left unrestricted and given continuous descent, the aircraft should cross overhead waypoint Betty some 110 kilometers southeast of Hong Kong International Airport at just under 16,000 feet, or flight level 160. Furthermore, the FMC will also compute a target holding speed at this level of 223 knots should the expected hold at Betty subsequently be required. Verifying this calculated speed, the crew conducted a little mental maths of their own. On the 747-400, a rule of thumb for calculating the flaps up manoeuvring speed, which equates to the most economical and minimum safe speed for holding, is to add 80 knots to the flap 30 landing reference speed, which at today's anticipated landing weight will be 143 knots. Hence, their cross-check of the FMC's calculation will prove valid. With confidence therefore in the figures being displayed, the captain will subsequently instruct the FO to simply round the figures off and manually override the 223 knot figure with an intended hold figure of 225. This manual overriding of the FMC predictions is significant, as it instructs the aircraft to use this figure as its primary speed reference, even if subsequent events will cause the FMC to amend its initial calculations. And as luck would have it today, this is exactly what will happen to QF29. Due to the congestion ahead, the descent from flight level 300 will be laboured and stepped. The significance here is that as the aircraft approaches the Betty intersection, while anticipating an entry into the hold at flight level 160, the aircraft will actually be 6,000 feet higher at flight level 220. In preparation for landing, following direction from the flight crew, the customer service manager will advise the passengers to fasten seatbelts. However, of significance is the fact that at this time, the fasten seatbelt sign will not actually be illuminated. As can be seen from the diagram, the published hold will require the aircraft to establish in a right-hand racetrack pattern, establishing inbound to the fix on a track of 344 degrees magnetic. At lower altitudes, this inbound leg is calculated by the onboard flight management computer to be 1 minute long. However, at intermediate and upper levels, this is extended to 1.5 minutes. The aircraft will level at 220 as instructed and commence its right-hand turn to enter and maintain the given holding pattern. Almost as soon as it does so, events on the flight deck will take a turn for the worst, as various stall warning, oral and tactile alerts will begin to trigger. From a normal, uneventful descent scenario, the aircraft is now on the cusp of entering an aerodynamic stall and uncontrolled flight. But why? Approaching the holding fix, service in the cabin's forward cabin will have been completed. The customer service manager, along with other cabin crew members from the forward sections, will move towards the rear of the aircraft to assist with preparing the rear cabin for landing, leading to more cabin crew members than normal being in this section of the aircraft. At 17:47 and 42 seconds, the flight data recorder will show that the aircraft will cross Betty at a speed of 222 knots, while descending through flight level 227, engine power being at idle. This airspeed will be slightly slower than the target of 225 knots which the crew had previously programmed, but this fact will go unnoticed by the crew as they both simultaneously become distracted by other operational tasks. The aircraft will then begin the right turn to enter the holding pattern. While still turning, the aircraft will continue to descend through flight level 222, and the pitch angle will begin to increase as the autopilot prepares to level the aircraft at flight level 220. 3 seconds later, at 17:47 and 59 seconds, the aircraft's bank angle will increase to a maximum of 32 degrees. Its speed will further reduce to 220 knots, and the aircraft will begin experiencing pre-aerodynamic stall buffeting. After the onset of the buffeting, flight data will show that the autopilot will be disconnected, most likely by the captain. He will then push forward on the control column to reduce the aircraft's pitch angle and simultaneously reduce the aircraft's bank. Due to a desire to remain within the protected airspace of the holding pattern, the captain will not roll wings level, as recommended by the operator's approach to stall recovery procedure, nor will he disconnect the auto throttle, as required by the procedure. However, what he will do in response is to manually advance the thrust levers, anticipating a potentially excessive increase in pitch resulting from a large, sudden power increase. His intentional application of power will be prudently applied from the lower descent value of 37% to about 73%. The first officer will observe the captain's actions and will be satisfied that the situation is being adequately dealt with. He will not identify it and therefore will not call out that the stall recovery procedure had not been completed. As a result of the captain's actions, the aircraft will accelerate slightly. The buffeting will stop, however the aircraft will continue its descent. 6 seconds later, at 17:48 and 05 seconds, the aircraft will descend through flight level 220. The speed will increase to the selected 223 knots, and as a result of the auto throttle remaining engaged, the thrust will subsequently reduce to maintain this value. With the autopilot disengaged and noticing the aircraft's continuing descent, the captain will pull back on the control column in order to increase the pitch angle and arrest any further altitude loss. 4 seconds later, the stick shaker will activate, indicating the wing's precarious proximity to the critical angle of attack, or CLmax. Beyond this critical value, airflow will separate from the wing and the aircraft will enter an aerodynamic stall, with lift on the wing being lost. In response, the captain will again push on the control column to reduce the aircraft's pitch angle and increase thrust slightly. the stick shaker will deactivate with the inevitable further loss of altitude. As the aircraft descends through flight level 218, the captain, understandably conscious of the potential for other traffic below him in the holding pattern, will, for the second time, attempt to mitigate altitude loss by again pulling back on the control column. As before, this will have the undesired effect of reactivating the stick shaker. In response, he will instinctively repeat his previous actions by pushing forward on the control column, again resulting in the desired deactivation of the stick shaker. About this time, the seatbelt sign was selected on. In an effort to break this cycle of action and reaction, over the next 9 seconds the captain will finally disengage the auto throttle, increase engine power to greater than 90%, while simultaneously increasing the selected target speed to 252 knots. The oscillations will finally subside, and as the aircraft accelerates, finally the angle of attack will reduce to a more comfortable value. At 17:48 and 31 seconds, the aircraft will level off at flight level 214, with the speed increasing through 238 knots towards the newly selected target of 252. At about this time, the first officer will alert the captain that the aircraft has descended below the cleared level. In response, the captain will ask the FO to request a lower level from ATC, who will immediately clear the flight to descend to flight level 210. The autopilot will be re-engaged in VNAV and LNAV modes, and flight level 210 set in the altitude window of the mode control panel for final acquisition. However, an oversight on the part of the crew ultimately means that this new reference altitude will inadvertently not be activated. The implication being that upon re-engagement, the autopilot will still see flight level 220 as being its target for acquisition, and thus it will command a climb rather than the intended descent. ATC, while monitoring the flight's progress, will challenge the crew, resulting in the error being trapped and rectified. The aircraft will subsequently descend to flight level 210 and rejoin the Betty holding pattern. Despite the altitude excursions throughout the event, no loss of separation will be reported between QF29 and any other aircraft. In order to get an appreciation of exactly what stick shaker activation feels like, this short video clip will demonstrate what happens as the aircraft decelerates while maintaining level flight. As the speed drops to dangerously low levels, the angle of attack is forced to compensate by increasing in value. The first abnormal indication to the crew will be the generation of an airspeed low oral and visual attention getter. If the pilot is to persist with this deceleration, as the angle of attack becomes excessive, the airflow will begin to separate from the wing, inducing a high-frequency aerodynamic buffet. This will be quite noticeable throughout the entire aircraft. Finally, slightly in advance of reaching the critical angle of attack, the motors located one on each control column will aggressively vibrate as a very obvious tactile and audible warning of the impending stall situation. This is the stick shaker. The purpose of the stick shaker device is to provide warning to the flight crew that the aircraft is approaching an aerodynamic stall. As you've already seen, when activated, the stick shaker vibrates both control columns, providing an oral and tactile warning indication. The manufacturer's guidelines for recovery from such situations is outlined here and must be executed without delay by the respective crew member. With first indication of the stall, the pilot flying, or the PF, will initiate recovery by holding the control column firmly, disengaging both autopilot and auto throttle, and smoothly applying nose down elevator in order to reduce the angle of attack until buffet or stick shaker stops. At the same time, the PM, or the pilot monitoring, will monitor altitude and airspeed, verify all required actions have been carried out, and call out any omissions. Continuing with the recovery, the PF will roll the aircraft the shortest way to wings level, advance thrust levers as needed, and retract the speed brakes. He will also ensure that the current configuration with regard flap and gear is not altered, in order to mitigate against the possibility of inadvertent drag increase. In completion of the recovery, the PF will check airspeed and adjust thrust as necessary, re-establish a positive pitch attitude while returning to the desired flight path, and finally re-engage automation as appropriate. Throughout, the PM will continue to monitor and call out any trend towards terrain contact. During the pilot-induced oscillations, the customer service manager, who will be standing in the left aisle in the vicinity of row 64, will strike the cabin ceiling before falling on a seat armrest, sustaining injuries. 5 other cabin crew members in the aft of the cabin will likewise strike the ceiling. A passenger located in the aft lavatory will also strike the cabin ceiling before landing on the lavatory seat, this resulting in minor injuries to the passenger and damage to the lavatory fittings themselves. A passenger in seat 63 Charlie, who will not have her seatbelt fastened, will also be injured. As the aircraft tracks on the outbound leg of the holding pattern, the smoke alarm in the damaged lavatory will activate. Upon investigation, the cabin crew will establish that there will be no evidence of smoke, fire or fumes, and that their belief is that the alarm is false, most probably activated by the damage to the lavatory itself. As a result of their experience, the captain will request a priority landing from ATC, who in turn will immediately clear the flight direct to Hong Kong International Airport. With the remainder of the descent, this lavatory smoke alarm will activate on a further 6 occasions. So what had happened to QF29 to so quickly bring it from a normal descent scenario to the point of it entering an aerodynamic stall, an uncontrolled flight? Well, the answer is exactly that: aerodynamics. As an aircraft moves through the environment from the smallest to the largest, 4 specific forces act upon it. Those forces are thrust. This is the force that moves the aircraft in the direction of motion. It is created with a suitable propulsion source, be that a propeller or in this case a jet engine. Drag is the force that acts opposite to the direction of motion. It tends to slow an object down. Drag is caused by friction and differences in air pressure. Weight is the force caused by gravity acting on the mass of the aircraft. And finally, lift is the force produced by the wings, which holds the aircraft in the air. When an aircraft is flying straight and level at a constant speed, the lift it produces balances its weight, and the thrust it produces balances its drag. However, this balance of forces changes as the airplane climbs and descends, as it speeds up and slows down, and of particular interest to our study of QANTAS 29 as the aircraft turns. In order to understand exactly what's about to happen to QF29, we need to explain a little more of the aircraft's aerodynamic model in the context of 2 significant events. Firstly, as the aircraft levels off from its descent, and secondly, having levelled off, what happens as the aircraft enters the right-hand turn to join the holding pattern. As we've already explained, in order to maintain level flight, the lift and weight vectors will have to be in equilibrium, which by definition isn't the case during descent. So as the aircraft levels off, this lift vector will have to be increased. But how? Lift itself is expressed mathematically as being equal to a half rho v squared SCL, where rho equals the density of the air, v the velocity of the aircraft, s the surface area of the wing, and CL the lift coefficient of the aerofoil. Density, velocity and surface area pretty much speak for themselves, whereas CL, representing the lift coefficient of the wing, is a variable comprising of details relating to the shape of the aerofoil and, importantly, the angle of attack, or the specific placement of the aerofoil to the relative airflow. In the given example of QF29, if the aircraft had actually levelled at the anticipated flight level of 160, the combination of holding at 225 knots plus an acceptable angle of attack would have produced the required lift to balance the weight vector, given the known density of the atmosphere at that level. However, the fact that the aircraft now enter the hold of flight level 220 means that the density of the environment will be significantly less, and thus the remaining variables of V, S and CL will have to be amended in order to compensate for its reduced value. The only problem now, and it will become a significant problem, is that due to previous pilot action, V is no longer a variable, but rather fixed at 225 knots. And as the shape of the wing will not be altered, the angle of attack alone will be responsible for generating the excess lift required in order to maintain level flight. But herein lies a problem. As the angle of attack is increased, the CL, or the lift being generated by the airfoil, will also increase, up to a point. The angle at which this relationship fails is called the critical angle of attack, or CL max. Increase in angle of attack above this critical value and the airflow simply cannot remain attached to the wing surface. As the angle of attack increases, for a considerable period there is a linear increase in the value of CL. Approaching CL max, however, as the airflow begins to separate, the slope of the graph shallows. At CL max, the lift being generated has reached a maximum. Any increase in angle of attack beyond this value will result in a sharp drop-off in lift with a corresponding increase in drag. The wing is now stalled. In order to recover from a stall, the angle of attack must be reduced to a value below the critical value of CL max in order that this separated flow can be reattached. So as QF29 levels off at flight level 220, in reality the true correct holding speed should be 20 knots faster at 243 knots. Thus, due to the aircraft's slower speed, the angle of attack is being forced to climb ever higher, all the time reducing the remaining margin to CL max. Were the aircraft to continue straight and level, this compensation for the slow speed would most likely have gone unnoticed, but remember, this isn't what QF29 has been instructed to do. And it is its subsequent roll to the right which brings the aircraft to the edge. As we've just stated, in level flight the total lift produced by the wings, shown here as the force Lt, balances the effect gravity is having on the mass of the aircraft, namely its weight, represented by Wt. So far so good. Now as the aircraft begins to turn, the total lift vector Lt will be orientated out of the vertical. One way to think of this is that the total lift vector will always act in a direction which is a straight line from the pilot's feet through his head. Although moved out of the vertical plane, a residual lift vector will still remain. We'll indicate that here as LR. It is this resultant vector which is left to continue the job of trying to balance the weight vector Wt. Looking at the examples presented, it can be clearly seen that the more the total lift vector is orientated out of the vertical, the greater the impact on the residual vector. In other words, the more the pilot banks the aircraft, the weaker the residual vector becomes. Needless to say, as the residual vector weakens, it will prove unable to adequately oppose and support the weight of the aircraft, and so, without intervention from the pilot, the aircraft will descend. So the question is, assuming that this descent is undesirable, as would most definitely be the case in a holding pattern, what can be done to compensate? Well, our problem is this. In order for the aircraft on the right to maintain level flight while in the turn, the value of LR will have to increase in order to balance the aircraft's weight. However, as LR is dependent on LT, what we really have to do is increase the value of it, the overall total lift being produced by the wing. So how do we actually do that? Well, back to the lift equation one more time. If our objective is to increase the total lift value, in order that LR correspondingly increases, then one or more of these variables within the lift equation must likewise change. But which ones? Simply rolling the aircraft into the turn from straight and level flight will do nothing to affect the density of the air through which the aircraft is travelling. Therefore, rho remains a constant. We've already established that the speed of the aircraft has been fixed by the crew at 225 knots. And as there has been no extension of the leading edge or trailing edge devices, the area of the wing will have not changed either. Thus S will also remain a constant. Therefore, once again, the only remaining variable to play with in order to increase the total lift being produced is CL, or in other words, a change to the angle of attack. In the context of QF29, this increase in angle of attack can actually be seen on the primary flight display. Try to think of it as the difference between where the wing is pointed and where it's actually going. That being the case, in the diagram on the left, the aircraft, as was the case with QF29, is in level flight of flight level 220, maintaining a constant indicated airspeed of 225 knots. The pitch of the aircraft, or in our analogy, where the wing is pointed, is seen to be about 6 degrees above the horizon. If the wing, however, is actually travelling in the horizontal plane by virtue of the fact that the aircraft is maintaining level flight, then we can say that under these circumstances the angle of attack is approximately 6 degrees. The diagram on the right now shows the aircraft in a turn to the right with 30 degrees angle of bank on. Referring back to our lift equation, as the aircraft is still manoeuvring through the same air mass, as we mentioned earlier, the density of the environment around it will not have changed. Likewise, it can be seen that the aircraft's speed has been kept constant. Therefore, if the shape and area of the wing hasn't changed and the aircraft continues to maintain level flight, can we see proof of a corresponding increase in the aircraft's angle of attack? Well, to the right it can be clearly seen that the pitch attitude, or using our analogy where the wing is pointing, has now increased to a value of about 7.5 degrees above the horizon. Again, by virtue of the fact that the aircraft is still maintaining level flight, the wing's direction of travel still remains in the horizontal plane. Thus we can say that the angle of attack as a result of the banked manoeuvre has increased by 1.5 degrees. Admittedly a small amount, but in the context of these aerodynamic models, every degree counts. The final two factors which will bring QF29 to the brink will be environmental and technical in nature. As the aircraft rolls into the right-hand turn, the prevailing westerly wind will act to increase the aircraft's ground speed and push it wide in the turn, potentially beyond the published lateral limitation of the holding pattern. In order to mitigate that possibility, the autopilot, which has scheduled the pattern to be flown with 25-degree bank turns, will allow an overshoot of this target up to a maximum of 32 degrees, with a corresponding further reduction in the resultant lift vector and the associated even greater demand this will have on the angle of attack. Simultaneously, as the aircraft descends toward Betty, with both pilots being simultaneously distracted, neither will notice that the aircraft's speed will have reduced below the already slow target of 225 knots. This will thus reduce the v-squared element of the lift equation, forcing the CL component to compensate still further by continuing to adjust the angle of attack value upward. What slender margin remained beforehand to CL max will now have all but disappeared. So again, to recap, if we mathematically display lift as being equal to a half rho v squared SCL, then 5 specific events collectively will conspire to bring QF29 to the brink. Firstly, the crew's manual insertion of a target speed of 225 knots was in itself not wrong, provided the aircraft was actually going to enter the holding pattern at flight level 160. At flight level 220, however, the reduction in the air density meant that in order for the angle of attack to be maintained at a reasonable level, with an adequate margin to the critical value of CL max, then the value of V, or the aircraft speed, would have to be correspondingly increased. The FMC calculated target hold speed and target level are based on the aircraft's gross weight and programmed VNAV descent profile. Below flight level 150, this speed is based upon the flap 30 landing reference speed, with the addition of a speed increment. This increment varies with aircraft weight and is designed to provide a manoeuvring margin equivalent to a level turn at 40 degrees angle of bank, or 1.3 g of vertical acceleration. Above flight level 200, the FMC calculated hold speed corresponds to the minimum drag or most fuel efficient speed. Therefore, at flight level 220, calculations showed that the optimum holding pattern airspeed would have been approximately 240 knots based upon the event gross weight and not the 225 knots inserted by the crew. Mathematically, this reduced value of v squared will force the angle of attack to be driven higher if lift is to be increased to the point that level flight can be maintained. This impact of the slow target speed is further compounded by the fact that the indicated airspeed inadvertently falls below even this value as the aircraft commences its turn. The increasing angle of attack will also have the effect of increasing drag, which, if not proactively managed by the autothrottle, will likewise impact negatively on the aircraft's indicated airspeed. Entering the turn, for the reasons mentioned earlier, the angle of attack will have to be still further increased in order to compensate for the reduction in the residual lift vector, as the total lift vector is orientated out of the vertical, proportional to the degree of roll. The effect of the sudden increase in tailwind component as QF29 commences its right-hand turn will cause the autopilot to deliberately overbank the aircraft so as to mitigate the possibility of the aircraft departing the protected airspace of the holding pattern. This again weakens the magnitude of the residual lift vector, placing still further pressure on the angle of attack being flown. As the margin to CL max is reduced, the airflow over the wing is beginning to separate, resulting in aerodynamic buffeting which can be felt inside the aircraft. Finally, in an effort to prevent further altitude loss, the captain's pitch up inputs on the yoke will reduce the margin to the critical angle of attack still further, finally triggering activation of the stick shaker. Analysis of the flight data recorder will show that crossing the Betty waypoint and a commencement of the right-hand turn into the holding pattern, the aircraft was still descending and passing flight level 227 with an indicated airspeed of 224 knots. Due to the effect of the rapidly increasing tailwind component, for the reasons mentioned earlier, the autopilot commanded a bank turn of 32 degrees, far greater than the 25 degrees which would have been expected. 14 seconds later, a simultaneous increase in vertical acceleration, pitch and angle of attack can be observed as the autopilot attempts to level the aircraft to flight level 220. Due to the resultant increase in drag and the lethargic reaction of the autothrottle, the indicated airspeed decreases still further. This results in the generation of the airspeed low, master caution, and the simultaneous onset of pre-aerodynamic stall buffeting. In response, the captain will disconnect the autopilot while simultaneously applying forward pressure on the yoke to reduce pitch and left aileron to reduce the aircraft's bank angle. In reducing the aircraft's pitch, this input will also have the effect of reducing both the vertical acceleration and angle of attack. Noting that with the autopilot disconnected, the aircraft had continued to descend, the captain attempted to mitigate further altitude loss by reapplying back pressure to the control column, and as a result all three parameters of pitch, vertical acceleration and angle of attack increased once again. This finally brought the angle of attack to a value which resulted in the stick shaker being activated. In response, over the next 26 seconds between timestamps D and E, the captain will trap himself into a series of pilot-induced oscillations, whereby in an effort to escape the stick shaker, he will push forward on the control column in order to reduce the critically high angle of attack, only to immediately counteract that by pulling back on the control column in an effort to mitigate further altitude loss. The cycle continued a number of times, on each occasion activating then deactivating the stick shaker stall warning device, until eventually recovery was achieved as the indicated airspeed increased to a point where reduction in the angle of attack was facilitated. Prior to arriving at Betty, the vertical profile in the flight management computer calculated holding at between flight level 150 and 160. When selecting a target speed, the flight crew verified the FMC calculated speed using the established rule of thumb. However, the flight crew training manual for the 747 advised that the computed holding speed, being presented under the given circumstances, would only provide for full manoeuvre capability to the stall warning activation at lower altitudes only, by definition this being below flight level 200 or 20,000 feet. It transpired that the flight crew were not aware of the requirement to use a different verification procedure for altitudes above flight level 200. Had the crew recalculated the hold speed for flight level 220 using the flight management computer, it would have provided a target hold speed of 240 knots. In this case, the flight crew likely did not have an adequate understanding of how the FMC calculated the target hold speed. They also did not understand the use of the best speed option provided for on the whole page of the FMC. The truth was that had they used the available best speed option, the FMC would have provided them with a hold speed for the actual aircraft weight, altitude and configuration at the time. This would have immediately highlighted a disparity between what should have been flown, that is 240 knots, and what was actually about to be flown, that being the 225 knots which the crew had previously manually inserted. The selection of an incorrect hold speed, therefore, resulted in the aircraft entering the hold with the selected speed of 15 knots below that required, thus forcing the angle of attack to extend to precarious levels in order to achieve the lift required in order to maintain level flight. Neither Qantas nor Boeing provided procedures or guidance which stated that a hold speed was required to be re-evaluated, where, on foot of entering a selected speed into the FMC, a revised higher holding level clearance was subsequently received. Therefore, the flight crew arguably did not have the requisite knowledge to identify the need to re-evaluate this selected speed of 225 knots. It is acknowledged that detecting a problem or an absence of an action can be particularly difficult where there are no clues to identify an issue. In this case, there was no procedural prompt for the crew to re-evaluate the holding speed for the higher flight level. Therefore, any potential re-examination would have relied solely on the crew's knowledge of such a requirement and a collective level of situational awareness which would have identified the need for such action. By their own admission, such an appreciation was fundamentally lacking. The only remaining mitigating factor which could potentially have avoided the aircraft's approach to stall would have been an awareness on the part of the pilots of the decaying airspeed condition on the primary flight display as the aircraft entered the holding pattern. On the speed tape located one in front of each pilot, the selected target speed, the minimum manoeuvring speed, and the stall warning activation speed are clearly and consistently displayed. Had the crew recognised that the actual speed being flown had decreased to a dangerously low value, below the depicted minimum manoeuvring speed, prompt intervention could have mitigated the eventual outcome, but this regrettably did not happen. At the time the speed was reducing below both the selected speed and the minimum manoeuvring speed, the flight crew's attention was focused elsewhere on other operational matters. The captain was busy reviewing the relevant navigation charts for their eventual approach into Hong Kong, while the first officer was actually engaged with looking outside of the cockpit for potential conflicting traffic as they entered the holding pattern. As QF29 made the right-hand turn to enter the holding pattern, the bank angle increased, exaggerated by the effect of the prevailing wind, and the aircraft began to transition from descent to level flight. The accumulative effect of these manoeuvres increased both the aircraft's vertical acceleration and wing angle of attack, which in turn initiated pre-aerodynamic stall buffeting. At this time, although it was not captured on the flight data recorder, all flight crew members reported a stick shaker activation. Subsequent examination of the recorded angle of attack at the time likewise confirmed that stick shaker activation did most likely occur. In consultation with the manufacturer, Boeing did concede that activation of less than 1 second in duration could conceivably fall between the defined sample rate, thus resulting in a failure to capture this data on the flight data recorder. At the time of the initial buffeting and probable stick shaker activation, the captain commenced the approach to stall and stall recovery actions required per procedure. However, after this, a number of other actions required by procedure were not completed, including the following. Due to a desire to remain within the protected airspace of the holding pattern, the wings were not levelled. The auto throttle was not disconnected. And due to the captain's concern regarding the pitch-up moment resulting from a large engine power increase, engine power was not manually increased sufficiently to effect recovery. Furthermore, the first officer assessed that the actions had been completed correctly and thus did not identify or call out the missed actions. After the captain's failure to complete the approach to stall recovery procedure, the aircraft entered a series of pilot-induced oscillations, during which the crew's premature attempts to arrest the rate of descent without sufficiently increasing engine power and before speed had been increased sufficiently resulted in 2 further stick shaker activations. After a 4th oscillation, during which the flight crew did not recall a stick shaker activation, and an activation was indeed not recorded, the engine power was increased sufficiently to accelerate the aircraft to enable the flight crew to complete the recovery. The Australian Transportation Safety Board, or the ATSB, considered whether the captain's performance was affected by a startle response. which is defined as a physiological reaction to a highly salient stimulus. Furthermore, such an experience will disrupt the individual's cognitive processing and can thus negatively influence an individual's decision-making and problem-solving abilities. Studies have determined that motor response performance during a startling stimulus can be disruptive of small tasks by up to 3 seconds. In more complex motor tasks, startle may impact performance for up to 10 seconds following the event itself. In exploring such physiological possibilities, it is important to draw a distinction between startle and surprise. In contrast to startle, which always occurs as a response to the presence of a sudden, high-intensity stimulus, surprise can be elicited by an unexpected stimulus or by the unexpected absence of a stimulus. Surprise can be described as a combination of physiological, cognitive, and behavioral responses, including increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, an inability to comprehend or analyze, not remembering appropriate operating standards, or simply freezing. In this case, it was not determined as to whether the tactile stimulus of the stick shaker and the oral alert was sufficient to elicit a startle response. However, the reaction of the captain in undertaking the initial approach to stall recovery did not largely appear to be adversely affected, as most actions were completed, with the omitted or incomplete actions being the result of deliberate decisions. When then considering the continuation of the recovery steps, he was able to outline the reasons for his actions, which do not necessarily demonstrate a negative influence on his decision-making or problem-solving abilities. With respect to the first officer, he perceived that the absence of his call-outs required of the pilot monitoring position, including not calling out any emissions during the recovery, continuation and completion, were as a result of experiencing the startle effect. Given that the approach to stall recovery actions overall were completed in about 10 seconds, this is possible. However, there was insufficient evidence to determine whether his was a response to a sudden, high-intensity stimulus. His reaction may appear more consistent with surprise, whereby there was a cognitive mismatch between new information and expectations, especially as he had no expectation of stick shaker activation. The recorded flight data showed that during the oscillations the aircraft underwent significant variations in vertical acceleration. The pilot-induced oscillations occurred at a time when the fasten seatbelt sign was not illuminated and cabin crew members were standing in the rear cabin preparing it for landing. The variations in vertical acceleration resulted in several cabin crew members and passengers impacting the cabin ceiling and furnishing, sustaining minor injuries. The impact of occupants with the cabin ceiling and furnishings resulted in damage to these furnishings, in particular the rearmost lavatory, which subsequently resulted in the activation of smoke alarms located in the area. Within Qantas, all flight crew undertook simulator training exercises as part of a cyclical training schedule. The most recent exercise undertaken by crews included an approach to stall recovery exercise, which was simulated at low altitude and with the aircraft configured with flap and landing gear extended. In this instance, the simulated aircraft response would have been markedly different to that of an aircraft operating at higher altitudes, with the landing gear and flap retracted, as was the case with QF29. Specifically, in the case of QF29, both flight crew members had undergone this cyclical training exercise, with the captain having completed the detail only 3 days prior to the occurrence. In the subsequent incident debrief, both could recall the correct recovery actions, indicating that the training had been effective in providing the crew with the required knowledge to effect a recovery. However, and of significance, this training exercise did not familiarise the crew with the manual handling attributes of the 747 at higher altitudes. It was therefore argued that in this case, the lost opportunity for the crew of QF29 to practice their high-altitude manual handling skills ultimately compromised their collective skill set for stall recovery in such a given specific set of circumstances. Conceivably, therefore, this precipitated the crews not adequately responding to the initial buffet and probable stick shaker activation, leading to the in-flight upset. Finally, in response to the ATSB's findings that the operator provided flight crew with limited training and guidance in stall prevention and recovery techniques at high altitudes or with engine power above idle, QANTAS commenced retraining of all pilots in stall warning recovery scenarios and amended recurrent lesson plans to incorporate more complex stall warning recovery events. The operator also updated lesson plans and distributed educational material to all flight crew. Likewise, in response to the view of the ATSB that the operator provided flight crew with limited training and guidance relating to the need for crew to re-evaluate their holding speed for a change in altitude, specifically above flight level 200, QANTAS amended the Boeing 747-400 flight crew training manuals relating to hold speed selection to provide enhanced holding pattern and information. They also updated ground school lesson plans and information to ensure standardized flight crew training and to further ensure holding pattern training was adequately addressed during these training details. Of note and proactive on the part of the operator was its decision to not exclusively limit these enhancements to the Boeing 747 fleet. Mitigation measures incorporated after the incident were thus likewise retrospectively applied to both the Boeing 737 and the Boeing 787 fleets as well. And so ends the story of QANTAS 29, an inherent reminder that even the Queen of the Skies herself must ultimately pay homage to science and the laws of physics.